Hello, my name is Chard deNiord. Welcome to Poets Speak, Conversations with a Vermont Poet Laureate. I'm very happy to welcome Tim Mayo this month to our show. Tim lives here and writes here in Brattleboro, Vermont, where he also works as a mental health worker at the Brattleboro Retreat, and he also works as a substitute teacher. He holds an ALB degree from Harvard, where he graduated magna cum laude, and an MFA degree from the Bennington Writing Seminars in Literature. He also has been studying the circus arts and the flying trapeze at the New England Center for Circus Arts in Brattleboro. His previous publications include The Kingdom of All Possibilities, or The Kingdom of Possibilities, I should say, that was published in 2009 by Mayapple Press, and most recently, Thesaurus of Separation, which was published just last year by Phoenicia Publishing in Montreal. He's also published some chapbooks, The Loneliness of Dogs, published by Pudding House Publications. He has many awards that include the International Merit Award from the Atlanta Review in 1999 and 2000. And he was a finalist in the 2009 Pominock Poetry Award Contest, and he has 5 Pushcart nominations. So it's wonderful that you're here, Tim, and welcome. I thought I would ask you to start us out here with a poem from your new book, The Thesaurus of Separation, and then we can begin to talk a little bit about both your career and your poems and your work, what you might be working on now.
Okay, it's entitled "Every Poet Needs a Brother."
Oh, good. I'm glad you're reading that one. I had it marked.
Okay, all right. And it's an odd poem in that there is in the towards the end of it a sort of a talk of a transplant, and how it got into the poem, I'm not sure, but I think it works in the poem.
Okay.
Every poet needs a brother. He will be a beggar, no, a barber, and he will polish your nails each time you lay down your pen, even though hair is his only métier. And he will practice the close measure of each thin line which grows from your head, cropping them all to their proper length. He will think you're a genius, even though he's illiterate. For he will know, as only he can, how the true sound of song which wells up in his soul is matched only by your words. And you will laugh at him for years for this simple act of faith. But when you die, he will still shave you, dress you in your blue serge suit, the one you bought for this occasion when money was of no consequence. And he will ask alms for your burial because you died penniless, now making him the beggar you always thought he was. Still, he will gain the pennies necessary to cover your eyes, and he will cross your hands over the hollow place where once your heart was, but now bequeathed to someone else, beats inside another's body, whose brother is also a barber. And in this odd new migration of things, where the little pieces of yourself are finally free of each other, you will find your heart cannot speak to the new body it inhabits. It cannot tell the stranger it lives in to love his brother as you have never done. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Maybe you could start by talking about the idea.
There were two poems that I read which sort of were in the back of my mind when I started this poem. And one of them is a Philip Levine poem, and I can't remember. It may be called My Brother Antonio, as a matter of fact, and I think it is. And I think he's actually referring to Antonio Machado.
The poet, the Spanish poet.
The Spanish poet who I think, I don't know whether Philip ever translated any of his work, but he certainly was quite familiar with him, having gone to Spain and lived in Spain and learned Spanish to do so. And the other, there's a reference in one of Ilya Kaminsky's poems about a brother, and these were there. I also have an adoptive brother, and I thought of him in terms of, we're somewhat estranged, and so I sort of thought of him in terms of that. But how this really comes into, does a poet need a brother, is that I think poets, I think on one level are, outside of society, outside of the mainstream, looking in, making their observations, writing from that. But at the same time, they need a sense of kinship, and so that was my idea of bringing about that sense of kinship.
Okay.
Yeah.
As you were saying, poets often feel that they're maybe in exile in the culture and the society in which they live, because they're writing from a perspective that's that, as Philip Larkin once wrote in a wonderful poem called "Talking in Bed," is at a distance from one's own unique isolation, and so that creates a kind of emotional need. And so companionship and a friendship doesn't always go hand in hand with that isolation that the poet feels that he or she is in the act of writing.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't. And if you, I mean, I live alone, and so there's the isolation or the solitude rather than isolation. But that creates an isolation in itself. The solitude that surrounds the act of writing, the sort of the time that I spend alone that can allow me to lead to the act of writing, which definitely is an isolated moment, and one that people can't participate in very well. I do remember with my second wife that when I started to write again after a long hiatus in my life, I don't think she ever understood that, so that she would just come walking in, from the other room and
that's hard.
Just bring up a conversation.
It's hard to understand for other people, isn't
Yeah.
it? So you have to be a little forgiving, obviously. You spent a lot of time in what you just called solitude growing up, and a lot of poets have talked about writing as a way of surviving emotional difficulty and trauma, and you're pretty unabashed in both of your books, Thesaurus of Separation and The Kingdom of Possibilities, in writing about some of those experiences. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection you feel between surviving and writing, the relationship between surviving and writing.
Right. I remember one time I spoke with Yusuf Komunyakaa, and he asked me, he said, I was just handing him a book so that he could sign it, and he asked me, he said, "Do you write?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "I can't survive without it." And he said it with with a conviction and and an intimacy that that belies the fact that we were strangers, And I'm not entirely sure that I'm in the same camp as that, you know, from an emotional need that I needed to survive. I don't know, because I spent a large part of my life essentially, I mean, a big period from the beginning when I felt like I was going to be a poet all of my life, to then sort of stopping after I dropped out of college, and sort of, you know, the small remnants of a writing community that I had sort of, you know, filtered away. And I really, for a long period of my time, didn't write, and then came back to it much later when I sort of, it was in my mid-50s or so, I sort of sat down and I said, well, you know, if this really meant something to you at one time in your life, you're at this point where maybe you should, you know, you've got to think about the things that really do mean to you.
That's fascinating, because it seems like the floodgates opened there.
Yeah,
You may,
yeah.
I mean, I know you majored in French at Harvard and mastered French, and wrote a little bit, and as you said, put writing aside. I don't, you know, you didn't feel the need, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I wrote poems from time to time, so I guess
but it wasn't until you were
yeah.
in your mid-50s, as you
Yeah.
said, that this need or this compulsion
Yeah.
came to you, and you started writing these remarkable poems about, really, a lot of them are about surviving, and dredging up memories that maybe you hadn't thought about.
Part of this, part of this I think has to do with and this was something that happened to me. Perhaps one of the reasons why I stopped writing is I didn't know what to write about, and as Stephen Sandy used to say, is that when he talked about young poets who were going on for their MFA and stuff like that, is that they didn't have anything to write about.
Yeah,
you know?
that's right.
And I, somewhere along the line, I did pick up and tenaciously held on to it unconsciously, but then when I started to work, much more so, is that write about what you know, and the only thing I really knew about were my own experiences. That I felt confident enough, you know.
Yeah, and maybe you began. You went to the Bennington MFA program pretty late. In your career. And you're probably in your 40s, late 40s.
Oh, when I went to the Bennington MFA, I was in my 50s.
Okay, so that must have also inspired you to write more and more.
Oh yeah, it was. Well, one of the reasons why I did it was that when I decided, well, maybe I'm going to revisit, you know, if this means the same to me, and I began to realize that it did. I had enough time in my life so that I could sit down and write every morning on you know, and spend a luxurious amount of time on it.
For the first time probably in a while.
For the first time in a while.
Well, you know what I would love you to do, Tim, is to read a poem or two, maybe from the new book, The Thesaurus of Separation.
Okay. Foster home. All you can tell is that someone must have said, "Smile," and you did, squinting out into the gray air as if it were bright. But your father presses his lips together, seeming to brace for something you couldn't see. Behind you, a lone Hortensia completes the picture, as though putting her arms around both of you. It has no blossoms. The full flourish of its leaves hides the complicated twists of its branches. And neglect has put this crease you see through your father's heart. So now it folds and closes like a card. There's a lot of backstory to this, and there's a number of poems in this book that are related to that. But to start with the backstory is that I spent the first 6 years of my life in a foster home of French immigrants, and there were working class people. One of the last jobs that I remember my foster father had was working on the Long Island Expressway when they were building that as a laborer. And he would go away for the week and come back on weekends. And I guess they must have been starting up island much closer to New York City, and we were way out towards the end. But years later, what happened was that I had a foster sister, a girl that was in that family, who was a couple of years older than me. And we kept in touch with each other off and on. And she came up to visit me here in Brattleboro, and she brought this photograph of what was obviously my father, because he looked exactly like me as an adult, you know, and myself as a little 3-year-old kid.
I wonder where she found it.
Well, she found it among her mother's her mother's things.
But this was your foster sister, so
my foster
not
sister,
your biological.
Not my, no. And apparently what had happened was that he had come at some point to visit.
Oh.
And it's an incident that I don't remember. I was too young. And this poem I worked on first. And it went through different permutations and stuff like that. And I picked Foster Home as the title to try to have that title say something that wasn't said in the poem, which is that this person, you know, that the incident was, you know, that it wasn't just any kid and his father having a picture taken at some point. There's a poem before that, which is called The Only Picture, which is also about the same photograph. And then a couple of poems later is The Trucker's Tale, which is from the speaker of the poem is actually my father, who's describing the visit. And this is a visit that I imagined and stuff like that. I like this poem a lot. Bowing to the minuscule. Each day you bow to the family of fruit flies flitting about the banana peels of your garbage. You turn to the mosquito and bless it with a gentle wave of your hand, praying it to live without blood. But it's not enough that you bow to and bless the minuscule animals of the world, their oozing larvae. You must learn to go beyond, to kiss the cold stone of the mountain, to press your lips against the invisible beings of the air, to abide they are there, yet never swallow their poison, and you must accept the perennial fly, its karmic place in your ointment. There had been an additional line to that at the end, but I felt which made it much more serious, and I just felt that it needed to be lightened up. You know?
A good instinct there. Talk about just the writing process of writing.
Most of it comes down. 80 to 90% of it is probably there in the first sitting.
Right, the energy especially.
Yeah, the energy especially. And then, but the longest part of it is getting, finishing that last 20 to 5, or, the closer you get to the end, the harder it is to try to find it. It's, you keep on sort of cutting out alternatives every time you make a decision to go with this or to go with that. So I didn't have to do a lot of rewriting, interestingly enough, for this, which makes it hard to sort of say, well, how did you choose this, and why did you choose this as opposed to maybe something else that you cut out?
Well, you work as a mental health worker. You teach occasionally. You substitute teach, and you're also involved with the circus as a trapeze artist. And so it seems to me, now that I think about it, that you're involved in all sorts of tension. I mean, and also maybe when you're writing too, because that can be a very intense experience. And so you would need to find some serenity in the midst of all of those activities and jobs.
In the hospital, when I'm working on the detox unit, it seems as though all of the patients are worried about whether or not they're going to the right rehabilitation center afterwards, and has their social worker made the proper arrangements, gotten a hold of the people, and then they're worried about something else that's maybe somebody's breaking into their apartment to steal their, or maybe they're worried about the fact that they are homeless, and what are they going to do, where will they be when they leave the unit. And all of these things contribute to, the worrying and stuff contribute, these are worrying about things you have no control over, contribute to making them go back to use or to drink again and stuff like that. And what we're trying to, we've introduced meditation on that particular unit, and we do it about 3 times a day or 4 times a day. And it's a slightly different meditation depending upon what time of day it is. So in the morning it's definitely mindful meditation. Then there's a breath training type of thing, which is a mindfulness in itself, but you're trying to think about your breathing, so the physical part of your breathing, so that you can maybe physically pay attention to trying to dissipate tension in your body. And by so doing, then maybe dissipate some tension in your brain with the thoughts that you're having. And then in the evening, we end up with something that is really designed to make them go to sleep. It's a relaxation type of thing. But all of this goes upon the idea that when you're meditating, that there is this part of you that's sort of up on top of you, me noticing, okay? And that in the exercise of the meditation, the me noticing, it realizes that you notice that your mind is wandering, and that you're not concentrating on your breathing or your knee or whatever it is, and that you bring yourself quietly back to that.
That's kind of a nice example of the unique distance from your own isolation.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of trying to preach that a bit more, trying to tell them to forget about it.
When you're in the act of writing, though, and you're in a kind of no man's land there, where you can't escape some sort of self-discovery or memory that would disturb that serenity. And I think you've been quite courageous in confronting a lot of subject matter that's it's difficult. The loss of your mother, for instance, the loss of your adoptive sibling, right?
Yeah.
It's both sister and brother, or mainly the brother?
Well, I had I don't think I've ever spoken about my actual adoptive sister.
Right.
And really, my adoptive brother is really sort of thought about. But so I have two different families here. I have a foster family,
Yes.
Which had a foster sister in it, and then an adoptive family, which had a brother and a sister, both of whom were far much older than me. One was 9 years older, and the other one was 11 years older by the time I showed up, and I showed up at 6. So they were well into their lives, and I was quite an interloper in the family dynamic, as it was.
So the thesaurus, the actual thesaurus for your separation, is the language, is the poetry.
I think so. Yes, it is, and the poems are all, to a great extent, are synonyms.
Are synonyms
for separation. Yeah,
and,
other words for it. Yeah.
I was wondering if we might end with a poem that is a great example of that, and it's either the uncapping or self-storage.
Oh, okay.
So I'll leave it up to you.
The book is dedicated to a woman who is now dead named Amelia Hancock. Mm-hmm. And it's her art that's on the cover, and which I like to a great extent. Amelia was somebody whom I was with for a number of years, mm-hmm. And she died as a result. She had a series of brain operations, 3 of them of which were tumor operations, and then 2 others which had to deal with hydroencephaly, which was happening as a result
swelling of the brain.
Well, yeah, and actually the filling in of the cavity where the tumor was with fluid which they were trying to drain with the use of a stent. The stent wasn't working right. And finally, she just was too discombobulated. She felt that she had to not have any more of these operations, so she died. This particular poem deals to some extent with when she realized that she had to have her 3rd brain tumor operation. She thought she had been cured of this, that she also had to move to a smaller apartment. And so we had to put some of her things in storage. Self-storage. It's not really the self that's in there. More like all the forgotten parts of your life you intended to revisit. The swimming trophy you crawled miles to win, or the gold stars on a 3rd grade calendar marking the few days of the 1 week in your life you behaved. Then there's those pants you think you'll sweat yourself back into. They lie folded among the paste trinkets of time, the jewels of your memory. But what if you could just cinch up the whole girth of your life, then flatten your beliefs right out of your gut, ironing out those wrinkles you keep stumbling over, and fold your whole kit and caboodle of a body, brain included, with all its loose connections, into some old snakeskin suitcase lying around with its rusty lock and faulty hinges. Then wait the long, humble moment it takes to at last be carried away.
That's really beautiful. Thank you, Tim. It's been just wonderful to talk to you and to hear the poems, and we look forward to new work from you, I hope in the not too distant future.
I hope so too.
Congratulations on all the success you've had.
Thank you so much, Chard.
Please come back again.
All right, thank you.
All right, you're very welcome.
Thanks.
Bye.